This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 130 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, I am going to share my tips for starting your own podcast. I have had my own podcast for 6 years now. I love doing it, partly because it doesn't require me to dress up, put makeup on, or leave the house. I also love it because I have been a podcast listener for ages, so I know how it feels to hear a person's voice in my ears week after week while I get dressed, clean the house, run errands. I feel like I intimately know those people, even though we've never met. And I've learned at least the equivalent of a master's degree from listening to them. So, providing that experience for other people is something I really enjoy. Every now and then, I'll be approached by someone who wants to start their own podcast. I really believe that anyone could create a podcast about anything, so I'm always excited to have this conversation. But whenever the person starts asking for advice, when they start asking for tips and tools and so on, there's so much to say that I don't know where to start. I've been meaning to put it all in one place, one blog post and podcast episode, so I can just direct people to that when they ask. That is what this is. Today, I'm going to share the tools and processes I use to produce this podcast, some do's and don'ts I've picked up through trial and error, and just general advice for anyone who wants to start their own show. Because most of the people in my audience are teachers, I feel I should mention that this particular episode is meant for anyone who is interested in podcasting, and that includes your students, their parents, other community members, and so on. So feel free to share this one widely. This is not going to be a totally thorough step-by-step tutorial, though. You can find some excellent ones online that will walk you through all the details from start to finish. The one I would recommend is from someone named Pat Flynn, and I will put a link to his full podcasting tutorial on the website. Just go to cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 130. So rather than provide a full step-by-step tutorial here, what I am going to do is just share my own process and tips. Before we get started, I would like to thank our sponsor, ViewSonic. ViewSonic transforms classrooms into immersive learning environments. Their education solutions drive engagement, energize and motivate students, and make teaching more fun. From ViewBoard interactive displays and MyViewBoard digital whiteboarding software to projectors and monitors, ViewSonic's award-winning solutions are here to help teachers stay connected and collaborate in their classrooms. To learn more, visit viewsonic.com/education. Support also comes from Justice Rising, a nonprofit working to build peace in areas of conflict through education. Right now, there are over 3 million children out of school in the Democratic Republic of Congo due to decades of conflict and violence. Justice Rising builds schools and hires and trains local teachers in order to provide quality education with programs focused on trauma care and peace building. If you're listening to this podcast, you understand just how important education is for impacting future generations. The dedicated teachers and staff that make these schools into safe places for children to learn and heal from trauma are real-life heroes, and they need our support. For only $25 a month, you can help support teachers' salaries and cover the cost of classroom materials. To join Justice Rising's community of monthly partners to help sustain the critical work of supporting teachers in post-conflict areas, go to cultofpedagogy.com/justicerising. That's cultofpedagogy.com/justicerising. The Cult of Pedagogy podcast is part of the Education Podcast Network. The EPN family is the home of dozens of different podcasts, and each one is focused on education. Check out all of our shows at edupodcastnetwork.com. Now, let's talk about starting your own podcast. First of all, what exactly is a podcast? If you're listening to this, I'm assuming you already know what a podcast is, but just maybe you're still a little bit shaky on the definition, so let's quickly go over that. A podcast is a set of recordings. These can be audio or video files, but most of the time when people refer to a podcast, they're talking about audio only. The recordings work a lot like a TV or radio series, except that people listen to them on demand through an app like iTunes or Stitcher, or just by listening on a regular computer. Most podcasts put out new episodes on a regular basis, but listeners can still access all the old episodes whenever they want. Finally, most podcasts are completely free to listen to. New podcasts come out every day, and there are podcasts on pretty much any topic you can think of. Fantasy football, gardening, aviation, Bible studies, fitness. There are podcasts to help you sleep, learn a language, or fix your marriage. There are whole podcasts devoted to collecting vinyl records and others on collecting coins. One explanation for this incredibly wide variety, I think, is because podcasts really don't cost much to produce. It's also not too hard to learn how to make one. You don't need a lot of special equipment. And once you have created a podcast, you can distribute it on lots of channels for very little money. So I repeat, pretty much anyone can have a podcast about anything. So I am going to break down my sort of instruction here into 4 parts. The first part, part 1, is going to be all about content. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of how you actually make a podcast, we're going to consider what you are going to talk about on your show. My best advice to anyone wanting to start their own show is to listen to a lot of other podcasts. The incredible variety of topics, formats, lengths, and styles out there will expose you to what's possible. And the more you listen to, the closer you'll get to finding just the right setup for your own show. Specifically, you'll need to make decisions about the following things. First is narrowing your focus. The first thing you need to do is figure out what your overall topic is going to be. Ideally, it should not be too broad. A podcast about life in general won't grab enough listeners unless you happen to already be famous, in which case people will tune in just to listen to whatever you have to say. Then again, if you pull your focus in way too close, you might only appeal to a very tiny audience, or you could run out of material pretty quickly. Here's an example. Say you're really into sewing and you want to do a show about that. A podcast about sewing needles is way too narrow, whereas one about sewing in general would give you room to explore lots of topics within that larger umbrella. Still, you might want to narrow it down a bit from there by making it just about quilting, or specifically for teenagers who sew, or only about sewing projects that can be done in a weekend. My podcast topic is very broad. I cover any topic that relates to teaching. This gives me the freedom to explore all kinds of things, but because my audience has a wide variety of specialties, I have to be careful not to spend too much time on any one thing. If I spent, for example, 3 episodes talking about math teaching, I could start to lose the attention of all my other listeners who don't teach math. Other education podcasters have focused in tighter on topics like educational technology, classroom management, homeschooling, or teaching a specific subject area like languages. While they don't have quite as much choice as I do in terms of topics, they can really dig into their specific target area without fear of alienating a segment of their audience. If you know your general topic but are having a hard time narrowing it down, try making a list of possible episode titles. If it's easy to generate 20 ideas and all of them have some connection to each other, you probably have a topic that'll work. If your ideas are kind of scattered and random feeling, it might be too broad. And if you can't think of very many, it might be too narrow. So another consideration within this topic of content is naming your podcast. At some point, you're going to have to think of a name for your show. This is another decision that'll be much easier if you just browse through the names of hundreds of other podcasts. Some will jump out at you while others will fall flat. Write down the names that really appeal to you and see if you notice any kind of pattern. Then, with your own topic in mind, brainstorm a big long list of possible names that follow the same pattern, and eventually something will start to feel right. At this point, it would be a very good idea to run your shortlist by some other people. Even though your favorite name might make perfect sense to you, if a few of your friends don't quite get it, you might want to look for something else. Another piece of this content conversation is format. Most podcasts have a predictable format that listeners come to expect in every episode. For example, on a Teenagers Who Sew podcast, each episode might start with a brief intro, then a 3-minute segment where the host offers a sewing tip of the week, followed by a 10-minute interview with a teenager who sews. Other podcasts are much more free-form, where the hosts just jump on and chat about a chosen topic. Another format consideration is whether you're doing a solo podcast, which is just you, an interview podcast, which will feature a different guest or guests every episode, or some kind of a panel podcast featuring a group of hosts discussing a different topic each episode. You might also jump around between these like I do, because some topics just lend themselves better to certain formats. Developing and sticking to some kind of regular format can give your podcast a nice professional tone, which can boost your credibility and make your audience feel like they're in good hands. If that's not what you're going for, though, then really the sky's the limit. Plenty of people out there will appreciate something that's a lot more random, so if that's your thing, have at it. Another content consideration is length. I have seen podcasts that pass the 2-hour mark every episode, no kidding, and others that are only 3 minutes long. So you really can choose whatever length you want for your episodes. As a general rule, shorter podcasts are more likely to be listened to in their entirety. This is just common sense, really, but it doesn't mean that people won't listen to longer podcasts. If I'm really into a topic, I will just keep pausing an episode every time I get interrupted, and will just pick up where I left off the next time I can listen, just like I would with an audiobook. So don't be overly concerned about making your episodes too long as what's there is good quality. What's probably more important is consistency. If you want to grow a loyal audience of listeners, it's a good idea to put out episodes that are roughly the same length. I haven't always followed this advice. Some of my episodes are an hour and a half long, while a few are only around 10 minutes. But most of my episodes are about 25 to 40 minutes long. I've never really asked my audience whether this is something that matters to them, but I know that as a podcast listener myself, I kind of like knowing what I can expect from the podcasts I listen to. And it's pretty jarring when things diverge dramatically from the norm. Something else that I don't think is important at all is having episodes be exactly the same length each time. Unlike network TV shows, which used to have to fit precisely into a time slot, podcasts have no such time restrictions, and you can drive yourself crazy with editing trying to make an episode fit a precise time limit. Really, it seems more like an exercise in perfectionism. If that's your thing and you get some kind of pleasure from it, then go ahead and enjoy the process. In general, though, your listeners probably won't care. With all of this said, it's important to be aware of time when you're editing. If you or your guests tend to ramble, take long pauses between thoughts, or just engage in a lot of time-wasting conversational practices that really aren't going to be interesting to your listeners, then cut that crap out. A long episode that's filled up with a lot of inside jokes and random side trips will just annoy your listeners. So within content, this is what we've covered already. We've talked about narrowing your focus, naming your podcast, the format of it. In other words, sort of like, what are you going to actually be like? What's the style? What's the length? And then we've got a lot to consider in terms of the content. Frequency. So along with length, you need to decide how often you want to publish new episodes. Some podcasts put out new content every day, while others release new episodes once a week, once every 2 weeks like mine, or even once a month. It really doesn't matter what you choose as long as it's a schedule you can maintain consistently. If your audience comes to expect new material at certain intervals and then you deliver on that promise, you will develop a loyal following. On the other hand, if you're not concerned with growing an audience, then produce episodes whenever you feel like. So the other content consideration, another one, is duration, whether it's a fixed or an ongoing podcast. So most podcasts are set up in an ongoing format. Episodes can be added and added for as long as the host wants to keep it up. An ongoing podcast can go on for years and have hundreds of episodes. In other cases, like with the massively popular podcast, which is called Serial, and that's S-E-R, not C-E-R, the The podcast is designed to have a fixed number of episodes because the host is telling a story. In other words, it has an end. Another example of this is a podcast by Seth Godin called Startup School. Seth Godin is a big business kind of thought leader. Startup School is basically just the audio of a workshop he did with a group of entrepreneurs. It has only 15 episodes, and that's all it will ever have. I think it was recorded in 2013. So these short-term podcasts are more like projects, and I think this would be a great way to dip your toes into podcasting without feeling like you're making a lifetime commitment. You might also divide your schedule into seasons, where you decide ahead of time that your show will run for 10 episodes per season, for example. Then you break as long as you want to, and if you want to do more seasons after that, you can, or you can just stop after one. Finally, one popular way to handle the duration question is to just produce a podcast that's meant to be ongoing, then lose steam after a while and stop making episodes. Not the most elegant option, but it happens all the time. Don't let the fear of this outcome stop you from trying a podcast. It's still worth a try. So here are a couple of other content considerations before we move on to part 2. And they're just 2 things. So one is this: unless your show is purely personality driven, like something that's, like Howard Stern's show, then a lot of idle chit chat between you and your guests or your co-host might annoy your listeners. So I would advise you to keep the personal conversations to a minimum. Most of the people who come to your show are interested in the topic you've advertised in the episode title. And if it takes you 20 minutes to even get to that topic because you're telling a funny story about your cat, you are eventually going to lose people. The other content consideration, and this is just advice, is keep a list of show topics to pull from. Before you ever launch your podcast, you should have at least 5 episodes completely finished and ready to go, and then roll them out one at a time on the schedule that you've decided for your show. Try to always have ideas for at least 20 episodes on your list and at least 2 finished episodes in your queue, so that when life gets in the way, which it will, you will still have a buffer. Okay, so that is all of the content-based stuff. Now we're going to get into part 2, which is the technical stuff. How do you actually produce a podcast? Depending on the type of computer you have and how in-depth you want to get with equipment and stuff, you have a couple of options. And what I'm going to do in the show notes for this, in the blog post, is I'm going to link you to Pat Flynn's tutorial, which I mentioned earlier, and he gets into some of the specifics. What I'm going to do right now is just cover some of the basics, and then I'll just talk about what I personally use. Okay, so the biggie with technical stuff is what you're going to use to record and edit the audio. Most podcasts are produced in their final form as MP3 files, which are just digital audio files. To make these, you need some software and some hardware. So, the software. To record solo episodes where it's just me talking, I have always used a free software called Audacity, and I'm going to provide you with links of where you can download it and a tutorial to learn how to do it. If I am doing an interview, I use a software that's called Zencastr, which works through the Chrome browser, and it records my side of the conversation and my guest side on our own computers, and then it uploads each file as an MP3 into my Dropbox. From there, I just pull those MP3 files into Audacity and I edit as I normally would. So Audacity is what I also use to edit the audio. So I can record into Audacity and then edit it also. When I am done, I export the recording as something called a WAV file. Even though Audacity allows exporting in MP3 files, I made this decision a couple of years ago because it was funky. When I downloaded the MP3 files, it was creating these other things called lame files all over my computer. So I stopped. I download it now as a WAV file, and then I use this thing called an MXsoft NTS converter, and that converts it from a WAV to an MP3. I get a little bit more technical in the blog post that explains why I do this, but anyway, that allows me to end up with an MP3 of the recording. Then I need some hardware. Microphone is the number one thing. It really, really helps to get a microphone. Most amateur podcasters just use a USB microphone, which can be plugged right into a desktop or laptop computer's USB port. First couple of years, when I first got started, I used something called a Samsung Go mic. And then a couple of years later, I upgraded to something more expensive. And now I use something called the Audio-Technica ATR 2100. And in the blog post, I have provided links to both of those so that if you actually want to get one, you can get one. Along with the new microphone, I also decided to buy a cheap windscreen, which is a soft foam covering for the microphone that helps block plosives. These are the popping sounds that happen when you say words with P and B. So I'm going to take my windscreen off right now and attempt to demonstrate what it sounds like without it. So it's going to sound weird because I'm going to be pulling this foam thing off. Okay, so now I'm going to say pepperoni, and that should be making more of an unpleasant sound when I say the P's. Now the windscreen is back on, and I'm going to say again, pepperoni. It should sound better. Okay. I also, and I've got a link to that windscreen that I got to go with the Audio-Technica thing. If you don't use something that has a windscreen, you can also get something called a pop filter. That is like a screen that you actually put in front of your microphone to block those. I also invested in something called a sound shield, which is sort of like if you took a folder and opened it up and stood it on your desk. It's sort of like that. It's got all this audio sound foam on it, and it's just there to sort of block echoes that would normally bounce around the room. I don't actually use it. I'm not using it right now, but it does an okay job, and it was, something that I was glad that I got. Finally, it's a good idea to have a few reliable sets of earbuds or headphones. These are important for listening closely when you're editing your audio, and also for use during interviews. So that's all the software and hardware. There's a couple of other things in terms of the technology that are good to know. One of these is the intro and outro music. Most podcasts, including mine, start and end with some kind of music. The most important thing for you to know about this is that you are not allowed to use copyrighted music. In other words, you can't just pull 15 seconds of a Lady Gaga song and add it to your podcast. That can get your podcast pulled off the internet, and it could possibly get you into trouble because technically you are supposed to be paying Lady Gaga royalties every time that chunk of her song is played on your podcast. And those royalties, I promise you, are way out of your budget. What most podcasters use is royalty-free music, which has been created for situations like this and does not require you to pay royalties to the artist. Typically, you pay a one-time license fee for a track, and then you can use it in your podcast forever. And I have linked you to two websites that sell these. They're called Melody Loops and The Music Case. Both of these right now, at the time of this recording, charge $29 per license. So it's a little bit of an investment, but it's not much. The hard part is choosing your track. If you're like me, you will lose hours of your life just sampling all the different tracks available. What's nice about these sites is that you can download free samples to play around with until you figure out exactly what you want. And the free samples have like little sounds that they put in them to sort of interrupt the music so that you can't just use the free samples, but you can still get a pretty good idea of what they sound like. So that's intro and outro music. More technical stuff, the cover art. If you're planning to publish your podcast to any kind of an audience outside your immediate circle of family and friends, you will need cover art, which should be in the form of a PNG file or a JPEG file. That just ends in JPG. Podcasts currently all use square cover art with a minimum size of 1400 by 1400 pixels or a maximum size of 3000 by 3000 pixels. If this language is boggling your mind, you just need to talk to somebody who knows how to do digital art, and they will know exactly what we're talking about. How do you create this file? I would recommend that you try a design site like Canva, that's just canva.com, where you can create and download a custom piece of art for free or close to free. Sometimes you pay a little bit of money for some customization, but there are free options. I'm going to link you to a little tutorial that shows you exactly how to create a little piece of art with custom dimensions. where you can set that at 3,000 by 3,000 and then just play around until you find something that represents you and your show. Finally, the other last thing about the technology is hosting. And this is something I did not know about until I actually started my podcast. In order to share the audio files with the world, you can't do it straight from your home computer or phone. You need what is called a podcast host. This is basically a website dedicated to storing your audio files so they can be shared through various podcast directories where people will actually find and listen to your show, like iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, and so on. The hosting site is also where you will store your cover art, the title and description of your show, and the titles and descriptions of every single episode. Once you plug all that information into the hosting site, it gets sent out to all the directories without you having to do anything else with it, and that's really nice. Some popular podcast hosts are Buzzsprout, Podbean, and Libsyn, which is the one I have always used, and I've been very happy with it. So I provide links over on the website to all three of those too, so you can check them out and think about what you'd like to use. So the last thing I want to just mention about technology is about hiring help. If you don't personally feel up to the task of handling some of these technical jobs yourself, you can hire podcast editors and producers through freelance sites, and two of them are called Upwork and Fiverr. That's Fiverr. These are sites where people could just get on there and they say, I'm a podcast editor or something, and then you pay them. And really, you can hire people to do the work from anywhere in the world. All they need is access to something like a Dropbox folder where you'd send the files that need editing. I have always done all of my own editing and production, so I'm not totally familiar with how the process works, but just know that it is possible to put out a podcast without really touching the tech end of things if you would rather not. Okay, so part 1 was content. Part 2 was the tech stuff. We've got 4 parts. Part 3 is just about interviewing. So if your podcast is going to include interviews, here is just some more advice in general. First off is prepare your questions ahead of time and send them to your guests at least a few days in advance so they can prepare. I have found that it's helpful to also ask the guests to just sort of sketch out their responses ahead of time and then share these with me before the interview. And what I ask my guests to do is just jot down some bullet points. Having this document to refer to really helps make sure that we cover every point the guest wants to make. And it also helps the guest know exactly where we are in the interview and when we should be finished. So what I do is I do this through a Google Doc. And over on the website, I'm actually sharing a copy of this with you so that you can see how I have it set up. It's just a really, really helpful thing. And I am also a guest on other people's podcasts sometimes. And I find that when they don't let me know ahead of time what the questions are going to be, it's really uncomfortable because I'm not good at thinking stuff up on the spot. So you don't necessarily have to use a template like the one that I have, but even just having them send me just an email that's got the questions, it's very, very helpful. So my other tip about interviewing is while you're actually conducting the interview, really listen to your guests and reply to them thoughtfully rather than just running through your questions one at a time. As a listener, it's so easy to tell when the host isn't really listening to the guest, and it makes for a bad interview. Active listening is easier said than done, though, because you have a lot to pay attention to. But just do your best to remind yourself throughout the interview to actually focus on what your guest is saying. So the last tip that I have about interviewing is about actually scheduling the interview itself. An efficient way to schedule these interviews is with an online calendar that I use called Calendly. It's Calendly. Using this tool, I don't have to go back and forth through email to try to find a time that works. I can just send my guest a link to my online calendar, and then they sign up for a time. I get a notification after that, and then it just automatically appears in my Google Calendar. It's just really, really easy. So that's called Calendly. So the last part 4, is just other bits and pieces. These are just other things that didn't necessarily fit. So the first bit is about podcast websites. Your podcast will reach a lot more listeners if you set up a dedicated website or web page for it. This creates another place for people to find the episodes apart from the directories and apps. Now, my host, which is Libsyn, they offer a kind of a website for this purpose, but I had a lot of trouble getting mine to look the way I wanted, so I just created a page on my own website for the podcast. If you want the easiest route, you might try a site like Wix, W-I-X, which offers a huge library of beautiful website templates, including sites that have podcasts. And if it's not totally free, it's very affordable. I personally haven't used Wix before. My site is built on something called WordPress, but Wix seems like a solid option. It's been around now for a couple of years, and I've never heard anything bad about it. So that would be a place to start. If you don't really want to have a full-on website, but just have something that hosts, that shares your episodes, that would probably be a good thing to try. Another one of the bits and pieces is about show notes. If you are going to have some kind of web presence, you will probably also want to create show notes for every episode. Show notes can be as simple as a few bullet points that summarize the episode, along with links to any resources that relate to the episode. Maybe these would be articles you referred to, personal websites or social media of, the links of the people that you interviewed, and so on. So in my own blog post or show notes, I'm going to link you to an example of some that I think are put together pretty good. It's from one of my favorite podcasts called Pod Save the People. Another consideration is transcripts. In addition to show notes, you also have the option to produce a full written transcript of your show. A lot of podcasters don't do this because it's kind of a pain, but I do it for two reasons. Number one, I want the content of my show to be accessible to everyone, including people who are hearing impaired and people who would just prefer to access it in writing. Number two, I do it because having a transcript published online improves SEO, which means search engine optimization. In other words, if someone is online searching for a particular topic, Google is more likely to find my podcast because of all the words in that transcript that relate to that topic. I only do transcripts for my interview podcasts because when I do a solo podcast like this one, I just write everything out ahead of time and use it as a blog post, so all the words are there. When I do a transcript, I hire that work out to someone I found on Upwork. That's the site that I mentioned earlier about a place that, where you can hire out help. Lots and lots of people do transcripts there, and it's pretty affordable in terms of paying people to do that. The last of the bits and pieces has to do with generating revenue. If your podcast starts to gain a large following, you might start thinking about taking on some sponsors who can advertise. This is a way to actually start earning money from your podcast. So what I've done is I've linked you to a really complete guide to podcast sponsorship that was created by another podcaster named John Lee Dumas. And it's a pretty good overview of how the process works. But just keep in mind that these are just general guidelines. Every podcaster who does their own advertising probably does it a little bit differently. I didn't start taking on advertisers until I had been producing my podcast for about 3 years. So all of the episodes prior to that have no ads. And currently I set a limit of just 2 ads per episode, which I run right in the first few minutes. I want to give my listeners a great experience, and I don't think a lot of ads provide that. I also make sure that I only take on advertisers whose products I really believe will be valuable to teachers and who have a good reputation. So that's everything I have. I would like to leave you with this. There is something really wonderful about the human voice, something that allows us to connect to each other in ways that words on a screen just can't achieve. In some ways, technology has put more distance between us with all the screens and whatnot. But in other ways, like with podcasts, it has given us access to each other like never before. And right now, that access is basically free. If you have listened all the way to the end here, my guess is that you have something you want to share. I'm here to tell you there are people out there right now who would love to hear what you have to say. So get to work. For links to all the resources I mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 130. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.